that they would not give consent to the use of foreign military bases located on their territory to participate in this aggression. And yet they too were drawn into this war. I have no doubt that this was one of the goals of that operation, which is called either bestial roar or some other kind of wrath. I don't remember, because the goals are now being debated by many, including in the United States. Many politicians cannot understand what the goal of this operation actually is. President Trump publicly said that we eliminated Ayatollah Khomeini, otherwise he would have eliminated me. A few hours later, his Secretary of Defense declares that the U.S. was not involved in organizing the elimination of Ayatollah Khomeini. Well, we leave the question of what the United States is trying to achieve to the discretion of Congress, to the discretion of that political system which functions in the United States for such cases. But I have no doubt, I want to return to this once more, that one of the goals was to drive a wedge between the countries of the region, between the countries of the Persian Gulf, Iran, and its Arab neighbors, between whom, in recent years, up until recently, a positive process of normalization had been observed. This was most notably apparent when Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran normalized their relations. Russia actively contributed to this. But in fact, we have been advancing a unifying agenda for many, many long years. For more than 20 years, we have been holding events aimed at mobilizing support for the initiative to develop a security concept for the Persian Gulf zone that would encompass all the coastal countries, their key neighbors, and would also include, as we had originally envisioned, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, ensuring transparency, confidence-building measures, and concrete steps to use this richest region in the interests of the prosperity of the peoples of the relevant countries. But this concept remains, unfortunately, unrealized. The West did everything to prevent the advancement of a positive agenda in the Gulf zone. The West, as the current situation with the aggression against Iran has now proven, acts on the principle of either-or, either with us or against us. And the main thing in all of this is, of course, divide and rule. In this case, one might perhaps say, divide, set against one another, and rule. I say this with a feeling of deep regret, because we are talking about our close friends. All those who are suffering from the aggression of the United States and Israel are our strategic partners. We maintain dialogue with them and will do everything, together with other peace-loving members of the world community, including in the Security Council and the General Assembly, to contribute to creating an atmosphere that will make this operation utterly impossible. I don't know to what extent it will be possible to help with such moral and political means, but everything must be done so that this voice, the voice of the overwhelming majority of the world community, is heard. But we did gather to talk about Ukraine, and I concluded the first part of my opening remarks with a reference to the West's policy of divide and rule, a policy that is also refracted through the principle of either with us or against us. This is precisely the same principle that the West applied in relation to the Ukrainian crisis, preparing Ukraine to become an anti-Russia and to become the spearhead of the West's war, a hybrid war, but in recent times, no longer only a hybrid war, but a direct hot war of the West against the Russian Federation. Back in 2004, when there was the first Maidan in Ukraine, when the results of the elections were annulled at the demand of the West, when a third illegal round of voting was organized, which was not provided for by any laws or the Constitution of Ukraine, and just before this third round, a candidate pleasing to the West was put forward to oppose the legally elected president across 2 rounds. And then the West, the Europeans, Brussels, publicly, loudly, to the whole world, declared, "We demand that Ukrainian voters, when they go to cast their ballots in the third, illegal, in parentheses, round of elections, make a clear choice. Are they with Europe or are they with the Russian Federation?" The year 2004. And since then, this approach, either with us or with Russia, has gone nowhere. At the same time now, you understand, the same approach manifested itself, especially manifested itself, in the attempt to drag Ukraine into NATO, although the harmfulness and unacceptability of these efforts had been warned about at least since President Putin's Munich speech of 2007, and then in subsequent periods as well. But when it became clear that this process of NATO absorbing Ukraine could not be stopped by ordinary methods of persuasion, when in 2021, at the end, in December, our official proposals were rejected, both to NATO and to the Americans, to conclude treaties on the principles of collective security that would not, in principle, infringe upon either Ukraine's security or Russia's security, and would take into account the legitimate interests of NATO. This was thrown in the trash, and we were told that this is none of your business. Our relations with Ukraine, NATO's relations with Ukraine, these are our matters. You should have no bearing on them. And even now, when the special military operation has proven that those plans are not to be realized, the stubborn Europeans in Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, and other capitals, I won't even mention the Baltic states, keep insisting that NATO's doors must remain open. And, incidentally, the fact that what they include in the so-called security guarantees is mandatory membership in the European Union does not in any way change their line of continuing the war, the hostility against the Russian Federation. The European Union now, in its rhetoric, has itself, it may be, already surpassed even NATO, and in its charge toward militarization and the sharpening of that militarization against our country, it is no less insistent than the North Atlantic Alliance. But we talk about parallels, either with us or against us. And so it was with Ukraine. This is now happening in the Middle East. And it is telling that NATO, as it has long been getting drawn into Ukrainian affairs, is now being drawn into the war unleashed by the United States and Israel against Iran. Mr. Rutte, who on any occasion delivers very eloquent testimony in his statements, said, "NATO is ready for the application of the collective defense article in the U.S. operation against Iran. We have prepared for this." What we are doing at this moment within NATO is ensuring the protection of every inch of alliance territory in a full 360-degree format. That is, he used the well-known image of Annalena Baerbock about 360 degrees, but in a somewhat different context. And the meaning of his statement, "Dear members of the world community," is know that NATO's interests are wherever we tell you they are. If the fundamental principle, the fundamental meaning of NATO's existence consists, as is written in the Washington Treaty, of protecting the territories of member states, then what does the Middle East have to do with it? Incidentally, the previous Secretary General, Mr. Stoltenberg, at a time when NATO was actively promoting so-called Indo-Pacific strategies on the Eurasian continent, creating its infrastructure there, creating NATO-like formations, triplets, quartets, and so on under various names. At some point, Stoltenberg was asked at a press conference, why is NATO spreading its activities there, to the Far East? After all, NATO is an alliance that first and foremost, and exclusively, should protect the territories of member states from external threats. And Stoltenberg, without batting an eye, said, yes, it remains such an alliance. It's just that today, threats to the territories of NATO member states also originate from Southeast Asia, from the South China Sea, from the Taiwan Strait, and so on. That is yet another trend, which is common not only to what is happening around Ukraine, and what are the causes of what is happening around Ukraine? Not only does this trend manifest itself in the designs of NATO leadership in the Middle East, it has long since established itself in NATO's approach to issues that are completely far from NATO. And it is no accident. They don't hide this either. Our British colleagues have declared here repeatedly, with the support of numerous NATO colleagues, that security in the Euro-Atlantic is inseparable from security in the Indo-Pacific, as they call it, space. And it is no accident, just parenthetically, that President Putin's initiative for all countries and associations of the Eurasian continent to gather and discuss among themselves how to ensure their well-being through the optimization of economic, transport, and other ties, how to ensure their security. This initiative is becoming even more relevant in conditions where, instead of the countries inhabiting the Eurasian continent, NATO, with an obvious presence of Euro-Atlantic mentality, wants to ensure this security. That is why, incidentally, this principle of divide and rule in the Asia-Pacific region is manifesting itself as well as it possibly could, so to speak. They are trying to divide the ocean, trying to tear individual countries out of the ocean and attach them to military bloc structures being created there, trying to undermine the ocean-centric nature of approaches to universal, inclusive structures that the ocean had been creating for long decades, which served in the development of positive recommendations. So we have many trends that manifest themselves in the most varied circumstances, in the most varied geographic spaces, including, as I have already said, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in the Far East. There is something else in common, and much is being said about this now by Russian political scientists, and that is negotiations. Negotiations, judging by the comments that were made at the time, were going quite successfully between the USA and Venezuela. You know how that ended. Negotiations between the United States and Iran had been established long ago and were, judging by the comments of the participants, quite close to success as recently as last June, when in the midst of negotiations, literally on the eve of the next scheduled round, a 12-day war was unleashed, the first act of aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The same thing has happened now. Last Friday, the parties left Geneva making very positive, optimistic comments. I spoke with my friend Badr al-Busaidi, the Sultan of Oman's minister who was the mediator in these negotiations. He confirmed to me that the American and Iranian delegations parted on a positive note, and that substantive agreement was very real. It was necessary, of course, to continue, but instead, the negotiations were interrupted. It was then announced in Ukraine that the Americans had been going through the motions because they had understood as far back as the previous round, as they said, that Iran did not want to fulfill their demands. Why do I bring this up? Returning to Ukraine, we too are conducting negotiations with our American colleagues who are helping in the dialogue with Ukraine. Several trilateral rounds have taken place quite recently. In Abu Dhabi, for which we are sincerely grateful to our Emirati friends, and in Geneva. We currently see no grounds to suspect that these negotiations are also a smokescreen. We do not, since we are in direct contact with our American colleagues. But those of our political scientists, analysts, political figures, members of parliament who by definition do not participate in a closed process, are beginning to draw parallels and ask questions about how these negotiations might end. They speak of the spirit of anchorage having been destroyed by the actions of the United States. I have already expressed my views on this topic. The spirit of anchorage was far from the most important thing. Spirit is an atmosphere. It was collegial, mutually respectful, constructive, but spirit evaporates. The main achievement of anchorage was not the spirit. We know how well our Western colleagues can create atmosphere, can create spirit. But spirit, I will say again, evaporates. The main thing at Anchorage was a specific understanding, reached on the basis of proposals put forward by President Trump and his team of negotiators. President Putin has commented more than once that we accepted these proposals, including those aspects of these proposals that for us already represent a serious compromise. And we proceed from what was proposed to us and what we accepted. That is where the current reference point in these negotiations with the American side now stands. As for the fact that over the 7 months, the 8th, I think, has already begun or will begin soon, that have passed since Anchorage, the Ukrainians and Europeans have made and continue to make every effort to redo, to rewrite the Anchorage understanding. This we see perfectly well. We see how in the United States the negotiators are feeling this pressure, feeling the temptation to yield to this pressure and to shift all responsibility for the next steps toward what they call a meeting halfway, on to Russia, in order to make it in time for certain significant dates on the political calendar of the current year. That too is a fact. But we, for our part, we remain faithful to those understandings that were clearly reached on the proposal of the United States in Alaska. You know, we had planned today to discuss the Ukrainian crisis through the lens of digital threats and international information security. There are many examples here that additionally characterize the terrorist nature of the Kiev regime, examples that show that beyond the physical sabotage of infrastructure objects, ensuring the normal functioning of the global economy, such as what was done to Nord Stream, such as what is being planned, The president spoke about this again yesterday. To blow up Turk Stream, Blue Stream, such as the completely legally sailing gas carrier Metagaz being destroyed from the shores of Libya with a Ukrainian trail. By and large, they don't even try to hide it. But beyond the destruction of physical infrastructure, Ukrainian terrorists are actively involved in the sphere of information security as well, engaging in cyber terrorism and targeting civilian objects such as banks, power stations, and transportation systems. And, of course, the Kyiv regime directly controls hundreds of so-called call centers that terrorize Russians, but do not limit themselves to our territory, and are actively operating in Europe as well. At the same time, it is a well-known fact that back under the Biden administration, the USA deployed entire units of U.S. Cyber Command and National Security Agency personnel in Ukraine. Representatives of British special services were sent there to coordinate computer attacks against Russia. The West, meanwhile, provided the necessary financing, supplied equipment, and trained Ukrainian hackers. According to our reliable information, this infrastructure, which the Anglo-Saxons created, the specialists, instructors, military personnel from the USA and Britain, is still present in Ukraine and continues to engage in this criminal activity. Let us not forget that back in 2023, several NATO countries, EU countries, and the World Bank created the so-called Tallinn mechanism, through which €250 million was raised for the needs of the Kyiv regime's hackers. And Kyiv was connected to the work of NATO's main cyber training ground, located in Estonia, the so-called Tallinn Center for Cyber Defense. Leading American corporations are actively facilitating this work. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, SpaceX, and others. All of them continue to provide assistance to the Zelensky regime to this day. Among the corporations, Starlink, Elon Musk publicly said that he continues to provide assistance to the Ukrainians in the war against Russia. And telephone fraud, a huge number of examples of Europeans suffering from it. All of this strengthens our resolve to fight against these destructive manifestations. Of course, the Ukrainians are not alone in this. These phenomena are universal in character, which is why, for a long time, persistently and consistently, together with our allies and like-minded partners, we have been advocating for the development of uniform rules for states in this sphere. And we are gratified that on Russia's initiative, in October of last year in Hanoi, the first ever universal treaty in the sphere of combating cybercrime was signed, the UN Convention Against Cybercrime. Already 73 countries have signed it, and upon entry into force, all states, all law enforcement agencies of the participating states will receive an effective instrument for combating hacking. We will work on expanding the Convention's reach, including through an additional protocol, and we call on all our colleagues to accede to this treaty. And, of course, I mentioned such a topic as the use of low-orbit satellites for military purposes, following the example of the American Starlinks. We advocate ensuring the regulation of such systems at the international legal level. At the end of December of last year, we convened an informal meeting of UN Security Council members with invited colleagues for the simple purpose of confirming that operators of low-orbit satellite systems are obligated to respect the sovereignty and national legislation of the states in whose territory they provide their services. We are, of course, holding additional events, including this year's main event in the sphere we are discussing, the Global Digital Forum. It will be held in Moscow on September 17-19. I understand that all countries present here have been invited. We very much hope to see your representatives. Returning to the Ukrainian topic, I want to say once more that one of the main goals of our special military operation remains the elimination of the threat to Russia's national security that emanates from the territory of Ukraine. This threat is of a comprehensive nature, including the threat of state cyber terrorism in which the Kyiv regime engages. We are grateful to all who understand the root causes of the current crisis. Any person even minimally seeking to acquaint themselves with the facts cannot fail to understand them. The security of our state on the basis of all norms of international law and the prevention of the extermination of millions and millions of Russian people, whose language, whose culture, whose mass media were legally prohibited by the Nazi regime now seated in Kyiv. As for how to move forward in political settlement, I have already spoken about this. We, I want to confirm this once more, are fully committed to the Anchorage understandings. Our American colleagues know well what is being referred to, since these were their proposals, and we remain on this position, hoping that no one will knock our American colleagues off this true path either. Despite all the efforts of Ursula von der Leyen, Mark Rutte, and the other masters of the Kyiv regime. Questions, please.
Будьте добры, вопросы, уважаемые коллеги. Bahrain.
Good morning, Your Excellency. On behalf of Arab ambassadors in Moscow, I would like to thank Your Excellency for having us today. And also on behalf of Arabian Gulf ambassadors, GCC, also we would like to thank you and appreciate the telephone call conducted by Mr. President to our leaders. Your Excellency, our country is now in Arabian Gulf is facing every moment aggression from Iranian missiles to our civilian places, and so many people have been killed during last week. And we know you have a special and strategic relation with Iran. That's why we are looking forward that Russia can play a bigger role and maybe put some pressure on Iran to stop their aggression against our countries. Because as you mentioned, and everybody knows that our countries are not part of this war, and we announced from the day one that we are not playing any role against Iran. So please, I would like to convey a message from our countries that Russia should have a stronger stand in this manner, and to condemn the aggression against our country, because also we have a very strategic relation with Russia, and we want you to put more pressure on Iran to stop this aggression immediately, as this will not help to end this conflict in the region. Thank you, Your Excellency.
I'll immediately ask you about this. The group of Arab states on whose behalf you are speaking. Indeed, you warned many of the Arab monarchies, publicly stated that the matter should not be driven toward a military solution, and that they would not permit the use of their airspace, as I already mentioned. But when everything began, contrary to your repeated appeals addressed to the United States and Israel, you condemned what the United States and Israel began doing, and, let us say, condemned the deaths of 170 girls in a school. I believe we must take a unified position. We are against the Gulf states, on whose behalf you speak, suffering. We believe this gives our Iranian colleagues no military advantage whatsoever. Politically, it is highly questionable that Iran gains anything from this. Quite the contrary, in fact. But we also cannot accept the logic according to which Iran's actions are unacceptable, while everything the USA and Israel do is not subject to discussion. You understand what I mean? It is an obvious thing. It lies on the surface. We stand for an immediate cessation of the aggression, and we will be sincerely grateful to both the Gulf Cooperation Council and all the countries represented here if you add your voice to this. Because the cause of everything that is happening, one can speak of the fact that Iran responded not as everyone expected. I agree with that. But when a country in the middle of negotiations is subjected to aggression, treacherous aggression, having agreed to continue negotiations, I have already mentioned that I spoke with the Foreign Minister of Oman, Badr al-Busaidi. He is simply in shock that everything turned out this way at the moment when, in his assessment, solutions had been found. Therefore, yes, we are in solidarity with all the Gulf states that are suffering from what is happening. We call for standing as a united front for the cessation of this entire war. Because simply saying Iran has no right to do anything means that you are, in effect, openly encouraging the United States and Israel to continue. This is illogical. Let us all together stand for the cessation of all combat operations, beginning with a full moratorium on strikes that lead to casualties among the civilian population and to the destruction of civilian infrastructure. As is happening in many Arab countries, we observe how the global economy is being deprived, at least for some extended period, of one of the main engines of its development. How oil refineries are being destroyed. All of this is terrible. I heard, incidentally, that your countries, I believe even Bahrain, now want to introduce a resolution in the UN Security Council along the lines of what you said, to condemn Iran's aggression, without saying a single word about the actions of the USA and the actions of Israel. This will probably only drive a wedge. I am certain that the Americans will, of course, not jump at this initiative. It fully corresponds to their logic, which consists in the fact that this regime, a regime that has no right to exist, must be finished off. Last year, the Americans introduced a resolution in the Security Council on Ukraine that simply called for the conflict to be ended as soon as possible. There were some additional elements as well. That was the meaning of that resolution. Let us adopt the same kind of resolution in the Security Council. We would only be in favor. I think it would be the fair thing to do.
Спасибо. Йемен, пожалуйста.
I would like to thank the MGIMO and the Diplomatic Institute for the excellent organization of this important meeting, and thanks to Honorable Minister Lavrov for the information important which we got today. Honorable Minister, you stressed the challenges of the escalation in the Gulf region going on now, and thanks to your solidarity words and condolence, because victims were in many of our Arab countries on the Gulf also, and we appreciate such sympathy with the victims. Honorable Minister, you have also referred to the Russian concept on the Gulf security, which was an initiative for several years ago, and recently also in the last few years it was developed further in a very comprehensive way of not only related to military buildup in the Gulf, but also energy security and other levels of security. I would appreciate your, Honorable Minister, if you can highlight more on this, and how much there is possibility to come back to such concept to develop further on any peace efforts. Thank you very much.
You are absolutely right. This has already been discussed for many years. We have been holding so-called second-track events in the expectation that this would help prepare for official intergovernmental contacts as well, at least starting from the expert level. But through our scientific institutes, several events have taken place, including recently. I ask my colleagues, since such interest is evident, and now the relevance of this topic is probably growing, we will circulate materials that reflect the essence of our proposal, and possible additional materials that show how those who participated in these academic conferences respond to our proposals. But the essence is very simple. Even, I don't feel like mentioning the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe right now. It is already becoming something of a swear word in certain political science circles. But at that time, the meaning was approximately the same as at the beginning of the Helsinki process. To gather, to discuss what problems exist, each participating country would set out the threats as it sees them or the risks to its security, and then begin with agreements on transparency, say, of military activity, on transparency, and possibly limiting the number of exercises that each country on the shores of the Gulf would conduct, mutual visits by military personnel, mutual projects in the economic and trade sphere, something along those lines. I will repeat once more. We will circulate detailed materials. Unfortunately, we are far from that now, because if, as our American colleagues, well, Israel even more so, publicly declare that this regime is illegitimate, this is their condemnation, which is directly contrary to the opinion of all members of the United Nations. The government of the Islamic Republic of Iran is a full member of the UN, and all of its rights must be respected, including the right to organize its own life, so that no one decides for the Iranian people. Now some American politicians are saying, well, we have already killed nearly 50 people there, so there is no one left who could just step up and lead the country right away. Therefore, let the Iranian people decide. Well, this is not even worth commenting on, they are trying to decide for the Iranian people. Therefore, I very much hope that the bloodshed will end, and that it will end not with the preservation of this approach, which essentially amounts to the position that the Iranian government and the Iranian system of state organization has no right to exist. Who gave such a right to whom? But is there nonetheless a small chance that this will end with the recognition of the futility of such adventures in the future and the recognition of the inevitability of arriving at agreements that will be stable, that will be mutually respectful, based on the principle of the indivisibility of security? Well, there is always a chance. At this stage, it is minuscule, but we do not abandon our efforts to advance this concept. As we say in Russia, water wears away stone.
Спасибо большое. Палестина.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for your briefing, for everything, for excellent gathering today. I have two questions. First of all, are Russia still committed, as Mr. President Putin mentioned, that Russia will participate in the reconstruction in Gaza with $1 billion? In spite that Russia not part of the peace committee.
Excuse me, Russia is still committed to what?
Microphone. I have two questions, Your Excellency. First one, President Putin officially announced that Russia will participate in $1 billion in reconstruction in Gaza, in spite of Russia not part of the peace committee. Second question, what now happened in the Gulf? All the world watching what's going on, and we don't want that the people will forget what's going on in Palestine. There's two things here. In Gaza, the situation is still the same. Up to now, the Israeli refused to authorize the Palestinian committee to enter Gaza. They are stuck in Egypt more than 2 months. And they are up to now occupied more than 55% from Gaza, and they control everything totally. In the meantime, at the West Bank, they are continuing their policy, confiscation of land, and officially they announced that West Bank must be part of Israel. So, what do you think? Where is the international community? Where is the United Nations? Where we are moving, with your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you. I will begin with the second question, because it is the foundational one. You know, we have been committed to the two-state solution since 1987, when the Soviet Union recognized the state of Palestine. Since then, we have had full embassies here, we have full diplomatic relations, and this was done taking into account a historical circumstance as well. And the historical circumstance is that the Soviet Union was one of the main initiators of the UN decision on the creation of two states, a Palestinian and a Jewish one. And that decision, when the General Assembly adopted it, can be reread. And from it, it follows very clearly that it was interconnected, but only the State of Israel came into being, which the Soviet Union immediately recognized. And the predecessors of Palestinian politicians, this is a long story, but for those who are interested, I recommend reading about how it came to pass in 1948 that the Palestinian state was not proclaimed. Here, one should rather look for the reasons among the Palestinian politicians of that time. And since then, when the war was unleashed, there were then several more wars, 1967 and 1973 of the last century. And each time the area controlled by the Palestinian National Authority shrank. Nevertheless, the official position, as far as I understand, of practically all the countries present here, is that we are all in favor of creating a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with its capital in East Jerusalem, with the right of return for refugees. We all repeat this. You noted this absolutely correctly. But if one follows your own reasoning and looks at the map of both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, it is hard to imagine how a Palestinian state can be created on the territory that remains unoccupied by Israel. You understand, President Trump's plan concerns only the Gaza Strip. This was announced, and it was approved by the Security Council last autumn, although it contained not a single word about a Palestinian state, not a single word about those decisions that were adopted in the United Nations regarding the Palestinian problem, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and it contained not a single word about the West Bank at all, in any context whatsoever. And together with our Chinese friends, we drew the attention of the American authors of the resolution to this, but they refused to take any amendments into account whatsoever. This is how we decided it, and so it shall be. Only a peace council, which will oversee everything under the chairmanship of President Trump. And we, together with our Chinese colleagues, faced a very serious problem. What are we to do? How to approve a matter, or rather, a resolution on a matter that has been at the center of the UN's attention for decades, without even mentioning the position of the United Nations organization itself? And honestly speaking, we thought that such a resolution should be stopped. But our Palestinian friends, and practically all the Arab delegations in New York, very much asked us not to block this resolution. In the end, the People's Republic of China, and we abstained in the vote. But our official position is, of course, that there must be a Palestinian state. Another matter is that this position is now publicly, officially rejected by Israel. We hear this. We see how Prime Minister Netanyahu says there will be no Palestinian state. We see how new settlements on the West Bank were approved, an unprecedented number of settlements that essentially destroy the connection with East Jerusalem. We hear how Israeli officials speak of the fact that 2 or 3 municipalities will be sufficient for Palestinians on the West Bank. I do not want to create the impression that we are always right while someone else is constantly making mistakes. But we recognized the Palestinian state in 1987, and at that time, I assure you, had all the other states, or at least the majority of them, taken the same position, it would not have been a fantasy. Both East Jerusalem and much else that underlies the regulation whose principles were approved by the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. But then, in June of last year, I heard President Macron suddenly say that we are concerned about what is happening in the Gaza Strip, and that in 3 months at the UN General Assembly, we will recognize Palestine. Well, firstly, why was such a decision not taken during all these long decades? And secondly, if you decided in June that you will recognize it, why wait until September? And I will tell you why wait. They were hoping that by September the issue would disappear and there would be nothing left to recognize. And certain other Western countries acted in the same way. Therefore, we supported Donald Trump's plan, primarily because it provided for a cessation of violence on both sides and was acceptable to both sides. And in fact, the number of civilian casualties dropped sharply, but did not disappear entirely. And violations continue. We see violations of those principles on which Israel committed to withdrawing from the Gaza Strip, as is indeed currently happening in southern Lebanon as well, where there were also agreements that are not being observed. It is announced that Hamas must be destroyed in practically all its manifestations, which diverges somewhat from the principle of Trump's plan regarding the disarmament of Hamas. The disarmament process itself is being interpreted in a very specific way. We see many steps that seem, sort of quietly and gradually, to justify steps that are contrary to the goals proclaimed in Trump's plan. But we remain committed to returning Gaza to the Palestinians, to rebuilding Gaza, and the $1 billion, the release of which from our reserves frozen in the USA, President Putin announced, we are specifically, and we have notified the Americans of this by note, directing toward resolving housing issues, social facilities, the restoration of civilian infrastructure, toward resolving all those issues that will allow Palestinians to return. We did not ask for these funds to be used for other purposes. Well, incidentally, following our official note sent after President Putin's announcement, we have sent an official note to our American colleagues. There is still no response. We have reminded them a couple of times, but they do not react. We only hear, though already now, I think, no one speaks of a Middle Eastern Riviera anymore. But there is some vague talk that, yes, it needs to be rebuilt, but perhaps it would be better to make some kind of resort there. It seems to me that this would be disrespectful to the Palestinians. They are trying to resettle them practically all over the world, from Indonesia to Somalia. It is for the Palestinians to decide, but no one can undermine or contest their right to their own land. This is absolutely so. But already in practical terms, some billions were announced at a meeting that took place not long ago. 10 or 15 billion was announced in various figures. But the fact that the Gaza Strip needs to be rebuilt, and rebuilt in such a way that the right of Palestinians to return is guaranteed, I have not the slightest doubt about that. Now, with regard to Palestinian refugees, no one speaks anymore about the fact that they always had the right of return, and if the indigenous inhabitants of the Gaza Strip are now deprived of the right of return, well, that will of course be a shame and a disgrace for the United Nations and for any other structures that are being created in parallel with the UN to address the problems of Gaza, and for Russia and for Palestine as a whole.
Спасибо большое. Есть вопрос от Лиги арабских государств. Пожалуйста.
Большое спасибо, господин министр, за Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for your excellent statements, and to everyone. First question. I want to express our position of the Arab states, and especially the Arab League, which was founded on the containment and ensuring of peace in our region. And therefore it takes care of its members. Arab states that are not members of the Arab League, and we had a statement that discussed and condemned Iranian actions against Arab states, because this is a very concerning matter. And we also called upon all states, and call upon you as well, to play a greater role and take action in stopping this insane war against not only Arab states, not only against Iran, but against the entire world. And this surrounds world peace and security across the whole world, so that it does not turn into a third world war. That is the first question. And we place our hopes in you as a trusted friend of all Arab states. As you are members of the Security Council, you have good relations with Iran, and we place our hopes in you as a trusted friend of all Arab states. As you are members of the Security Council, you have good relations with Iran, with Arab countries, and with the USA. Arab countries and with the USA. Therefore, we once again call upon you to take action, and jointly, possibly together with Oman, which has played and continues to play a major role in this effort, perhaps to turn this matter to the negotiating table. And my second question concerns the negotiations with Ukraine. I have not heard very much about the negotiations right now, but I want to hear from you how you assess the latest negotiations that are ongoing and will continue with Ukraine, but of three countries jointly with the USA. And especially now, there is talk in the press, in newspapers, on the internet about a dirty bomb that the West wants to give to Ukraine. And does this affect the negotiations with your country? Thank you very much, and I apologize for going on so long. Thank you.
Как вы оцениваете последние переговоры, которые идет и будет с Украиной, но трех стран совместно с США? И особенно сейчас идет в это время в прессах, в газетах, в интернете грязная бомба, которые хотят Запад отдать Украине. И влияет ли это на переговоры с вашей стороны? Большое спасибо и извините, что я долго. Спасибо.
Thank you. To the first question, I can only repeat what I said in response to the statement of the distinguished ambassador of Bahrain. You are calling on us to stop this, taking into account our relations with Iran, with the Arabs, with the United States. But my answer is, we want to stop it, but let us do this together. To do so, it will be necessary not simply to say that Iran must stop. For that, it will be necessary to assess the entire picture. And, as I have already said, why not come out in favor of adopting a resolution in the Security Council, perhaps in the General Assembly as well, in addition to the Security Council, that would call for an immediate end to this conflict? One could mention there, as a first step, as a priority, the cessation of actions that cause harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. This can only be done collectively. Otherwise, it will look as though we are condemning some things and not condemning others. The West has a habit of canceling history. It manifested itself in full measure, incidentally, in the case of Ukraine as well. when in February 2014 a state coup took place. Moreover, the coup took place the morning after Germany, France, and Poland had acted as guarantors of an agreement on a settlement between the president and the opposition. The essence of the agreement was the holding of early presidential elections, and everyone calmed down. But the morning after, the opposition tore up these agreements. France, Germany, and Poland swallowed all of this, and a Nazi regime came to power. Its very first announcement was to eliminate the status of the Russian language. Its second action was to send armed militants to storm the Parliament of Crimea, which refused to recognize the legitimacy of this bloody coup. And Crimea then, with the help of our servicemen, we always had a naval base in Crimea. Crimea held a referendum and reunited with Russia. The West raised a clamor, an outcry. And from then on, for long years, when we were still talking with them, they would say, "You annexed Crimea, and thereby you started the Ukrainian crisis and this whole war." We say, "But what about the coup?" Because Crimea voted in a referendum to join Russia as a result of the coup, in protest against the coup. No, no, you annexed it. History is being cancelled. History that is of the most fundamental importance for understanding the root causes of one or another situation. In exactly the same way here, well, we probably cannot cancel June of last year, when in the middle of negotiations the first act of aggression against Iran took place. When, incidentally, it was announced, President Trump announced afterward, that all nuclear facilities had been destroyed. And here, incidentally, I will mention in parentheses that we do not quite understand the role of the IAEA and its secretariat, because never, not once, nowhere, not in a single IAEA report, was there even a hint of suspicion that Iran might have a nuclear bomb. Yes, there were facts about it having a large quantity of enriched uranium, moreover, enriched to a higher level than necessary for energy production. But no one mentions that Iran only began to ramp up enrichment when the United States, in 2017, I believe, withdrew from the agreement on regulating the Iranian nuclear program. While the agreement was in force, it had been approved unanimously by the Security Council, Iran strictly observed all the restrictions that had been imposed there. But as soon as the USA withdrew from this agreement, and Europe cowardly said nothing, and did not even express any kind of protest, Iran also waited and waited. And then, as a reaction, in order to at least somehow stimulate the return of conscience in the Western colleagues who had with their own hands destroyed a Security Council decision, it began to ramp up enrichment. This, of course, did not add to peacefulness, but nevertheless, it was justified. And when Iran's actions began to be condemned, this was again an attempt to cancel history. To cancel that part which concerned the complete withdrawal of the United States, without any explanation, from an agreement that imposed restrictions on Iran, restrictions that Iran had been scrupulously fulfilling. And now, you understand, there were cases last year when the IAEA was considering the Director General's report, and it contained ambiguous formulations, and then Britain, France, and Germany introduced a resolution, latching onto these ambiguous formulations and began pushing through, first in the IAEA and then in the UN Security Council, a decision to reinstate already expired sanctions against Iran. This is such manipulation of international law, such contempt for the facts, such a simply brazen attempt to justify their own actions and to punish Iran in a completely undeserved manner.
Это такое манипулирование.
Well, knowing the Europeans, one need not be surprised, but each time they still display certain qualities that create additional opportunities for astonishment. And when Mr. Grossi was asked about this, about the IAEA, he said that his previous reports indicate that until Iran assists the IAEA in resolving outstanding safeguards issues, the agency will not be able to guarantee that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively peaceful in nature. And do you know what this refers to? Until Iran assists in resolving outstanding safeguards issues? The IAEA is insisting on gaining access to those facilities whose nuclear programs were bombed by the United States in June. That is what they were insisting on until recently. Iran, and we, for that matter, asked the agency, but these facilities, they are under IAEA control, under IAEA safeguards, and they bombed them, which is categorically prohibited. Might the IAEA not express its point of view regarding this unlawful act? It did not work out. The IAEA simply began saying, "We need access to these facilities." Again, you understand, history is being cancelled, the history of the beginning of this process. Facilities that are inviolable under all the rules, since they are under IAEA control, were bombed. And the IAEA stays silent and says, "May I go and see what remains there and what does not?" This is not a professional approach. This is a politicized approach. But my point is that this too, when the IAEA was inserting and circulating its latest reports, this too represents an attempt to cancel history. And the new aggression we are now witnessing is also from the same opera. Everything connected with the negotiations, with the commentaries, with the efforts of Iran, with the efforts of those countries that tried to mediate, all of this is being cancelled. This concerns the Russian Federation. President Putin, receiving both representatives of the USA and representatives of Iran and representatives of Israel over recent months, more than once proposed, if all parties agreed, our services, which would absolutely certainly have resolved the problem of suspicions regarding the large stockpiles of highly enriched uranium of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is well known to everyone. And everything would have been resolved long ago. But this history too has been cancelled, including the conversations between us and the Americans, between us and the Israelis. It is simply said, if we had not killed the Ayatollah, he would have killed the President of the USA. And that is that. And what one sees further, shown live in real time, is that this is a rogue state. It has no right to exist, that the Kurdish factor needs to be stirred up, and much else besides. Therefore, simply put, we are in solidarity with the Arab states, the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. But we are also in solidarity with Iran, because all these long years we have been trying to facilitate those processes that were taking shape, that took root, and were strengthening in this region. The normalization of Iran's relations with the Arabs. We tried in every way to help. Today our concept was recalled. Others, well, those who are now bombing Iran, wanted the directly opposite result. Returning to where I began. Divide and rule, set against one another, and then inflame passions so that those who found themselves the victims of such a policy of divide and rule would raise their voices and demand the condemnation of Iran in this particular case. Let us together raise our voices for all of this to stop.
возвышали голос и требовали осудить Иран.
There must be a simple, not verbose, one-page Security Council resolution on Iran. We are ready to prepare such a draft in New York with our friends and for our friends, and to see what the reaction will be.
Какая будет реакция?
Спасибо большое. Иран.
In the name of God, Excellency, Mr. Lavrov, dear colleagues, good day to you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to raise some points. As you know, these days, my country is involved in a real war. The war that we did not begin it, but it was imposed on us. In fact, they attacked us, the United States and the Israeli regime, on February 28, 2026, against defensive facilities and civilian locations in various Iranian cities, is a clear violation of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter and constitutes an act of obvious armed aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since the beginning of this unprovoked and unjustified aggression by the US and the Israeli regime against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Islamic Republic of Iran, numerous military strikes have been carried out against civilian targets, including schools, hospitals, and emergency equipment and personnel. These attacks have resulted in the martyrdom of many innocent civilians, including women and children, and the injury of many more. In response to this act of aggression by the United States and the Israeli regime, which is considered a gross violation of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, the Islamic Republic of Iran is exercising its inherent and legitimate right to self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. The armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran will utilize all necessary defensive capabilities and means to confront this criminal aggression and deter hostile actions. Regarding the statements of our friends from Arab countries, I would like to emphasize that the Arab states of the Persian Gulf are our neighbors and Muslim brothers. Iran's actions in the region are against the US military bases, where are used to attack us. Iran holds no hostility toward the Persian Gulf countries and is determined to continue relations based on good neighborliness with them. Iran's defensive response to US military bases in certain Persian Gulf countries should not be perceived as an attack on those nations. Rather, it is considered our legitimate response to the origin of the aggression. At the end, I would like to appreciate the Russian Foreign Ministry for its stance in condemning these attacks. Many independent states around the world, like Russia, have condemned these illegal and illegitimate attacks because they had no legal reason to launch a military attack on my country. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Well, I understood this to be simply a statement, not a question. I would like to apologize to the representative of the Arab League. I did not answer the second question he asked about the trilateral negotiations on the Ukrainian settlement. Well, in principle, unlike some other participants, we approach negotiations professionally and avoid public speculation, and even more so, leaks of information. especially information that is misleading. Professional diplomacy presupposes negotiations that prefer silence until a result has been achieved. But information has already been seeping out, including from our official representatives, to the extent that such information can be provided. There is a certain degree of progress. Following the negotiations that took place in Abu Dhabi, 2 rounds were held there, and the most recent round took place in Geneva. And there is progress once again on humanitarian issues, the exchange of prisoners, the exchange of bodies, and there is, as I understand it, progress in terms of developing a common understanding of the mechanism that will ensure monitoring of eventual agreements. But those very eventual agreements, the main agreements, the substantive agreements, have not yet been reached. I will repeat once more. For us, it is an absolute given that such agreements must be based on the Alaska understandings, on the understandings that were agreed upon on the basis of proposals from the American side, and which the Russian side accepted with a certain element of compromise. And we were confident that the matter was closed, and that the initiative of President Trump, which he announced, would be realized. But, as I have already mentioned, the European masters of Ukraine, together with the Zelensky regime, began doing everything to undermine the understandings reached in Alaska. And probably the main points here, the things being talked about, are the following. They want to undermine the understanding that Ukraine has no place in NATO. And they resort to the most varied arguments for this, including declaring that this is a limitation of rights, freedoms, and so on. I want to remind once more that the Russian Federation recognized the state of Ukraine within the 1991 borders on the basis of the Declaration of State Sovereignty, which the Ukrainian leadership adopted, the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet adopted, before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In this declaration, it was clearly written that Ukraine would be a non-bloc neutral, nuclear-free state. In this same declaration, linguistic, educational, and other rights were guaranteed to all national groups inhabiting Ukraine. It was in this capacity that the Russian Federation, and it was in this capacity that Ukraine retained its seat in the United Nations. And when you are told, well, let us resolve the territorial question. We will give you something, we will not give you something else, and we will not prohibit Ukraine from joining NATO. We will not demand that this regime repeal all the discriminatory Nazi laws, banning the language, banning religion. Well, one can hardly call that a serious approach. Because, for example, we have just been discussing at length both the Iranian situation and the Palestinian situation. In Iran, you can freely speak Hebrew. You can go to a synagogue. No one prohibits this there. In Palestine, you can also speak Hebrew, as in all Arab countries. And in Israel, Arabic is very widely used, alongside Russian, incidentally. There is no other country in the world where a language is prohibited by law. And yet the language is banned in the spheres of education at all levels, culture, mass media, and so on. And the same goes for the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And we are told, don't worry about that for now. The territories, make us some compromise on territories somewhere. What compromise when the inhabitants? We are not talking about the land. We are talking about those people who voted on that land against remaining under the authority of a Nazi regime and for reunification with the Russian Federation. And when they say, well, the territory is settled now, everything has been resolved, only the territory remains. Zelensky declares at every corner that the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine has been agreed upon finally. That's it. We are ready to accept it already. The guarantees are supported by both the Europeans and the United States. We ask the United States, is this really so? Well, we have not yet received an answer. And the guarantees, as Zelensky describes them, consist in the fact that Ukraine, within whatever borders remain to this Nazi state, will be guaranteed security. That within the framework of these guarantees, it will be admitted to the European Union, which already takes anti-Russian positions even more aggressively than NATO, creates its own structure, armaments, in preparation for war with Russia. That within the framework of these guarantees, some contingent will be deployed on Ukrainian territory, in addition to those British, French, and other instructors who are already there in great numbers and have been for a long time directly participating, in effect, in the preparation of combat operations. And all of this is announced by various figures such as Rutte, von der Leyen, Macron. They may also tuck Ukraine under Macron's nuclear umbrella in his latest initiative, not the Cherbourg one, but the Macron one, which the current French leaders want to extend over all of Europe. We proceed from the fact that we have not merely not approved these guarantees, we have not even seen them. And everything that is being thrown into the public space on this topic reflects, among other things, complete disrespect for the negotiations that were, after all, initiated by the American side on its own initiative. The guarantees I am speaking of, you can all draw your own conclusions here, are aimed not at ensuring indivisible security, equal security in this part of the world and in Europe, but at continuing to prepare Ukraine to pump it with money and weapons to deploy troops in Ukraine. All with the same goal of attempting once again to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. This differs by 180 degrees from what was agreed in Istanbul 3 years ago, in March-April 2022, on the proposal of the Ukrainians themselves, where security guarantees were envisioned as collective, with the participation of all members of the UN Security Council, that is, including Russia and China, and where these guarantees would be provided on the basis of consensus. All of this has been crossed out. Therefore, it is difficult for me to speak about the prospects for further negotiations while we are only asking these questions of our American colleagues. And I hope that those principles that President Trump, together with President Putin, laid down in Alaska, that just as we do, our American colleagues also consider these principles to be fully preserved and ready for negotiations. But I will repeat once more. We observe how negotiations very often become a cover for not entirely friendly actions. Well, indeed, we see how the United States continues to provide intelligence data to the Ukrainian regime, continues to sell weapons to the Europeans, so that they then transfer it at their own expense to the Kiev regime. And if you simply look at the news of the past several months, you will see that sanctions against the Russian Federation are already far from being merely the legacy of Biden. More and more serious sanctions aimed at squeezing Russia out of global energy markets are being adopted by the Trump administration as well. And the goal of squeezing us out is stated directly. So we want, apart from those goals that President Putin has set in the Ukrainian situation, which will unconditionally be achieved, preferably through negotiations, but if not through negotiations, then by other means. Apart from this, we also want to have an honest conversation in the Security Council, first and foremost in the format of the 5 permanent members, and in a broader format, about what kind of world we have found ourselves in. When the largest power by economic and other indicators declares that international law is already a thing of the past, that the only morality that exists is the one this power understands. And when this power declares that the rules-based order is also a thing of the past, and that the rules now will not be within the framework of an order, but within the framework of unilateral decisions. But all of this is being proclaimed loudly. And it seems to me that the allies of the United States within NATO would absolutely want to conduct some such discussion among themselves. But the question is far broader than the fate of the Golden Billion. There are other parts of the world as well, which some representatives of the Golden Billion call jungles, and which are quite well represented here. Therefore, the conversation about the world order, about the principles of the world order, it has, of course, become overdue. And I think that apart from the various political science conferences that are increasingly turning to this topic, the United Nations as well could think about trying to initiate and stimulate some such discussion. So far, the UN is occupied with various one-off statements, not always consistent statements, that react to individual manifestations of this current chaos by and large. So I want to conclude our meeting by expressing the hope that all of us, your governments and those countries not represented here, including the Western countries, are nonetheless interested in understanding what kind of world we are not just living in, but entering right now, and how in this world the interests of each state will be realized, including, and I will emphasize this once more, the realization of the special responsibility of nuclear powers. And I very much hope that the current war against Iran will not undermine the foundations of the principles of nuclear non-proliferation. This is already being said aloud, that the proclaimed goal is to deprive Iran of nuclear weapons. In reality, the United States and Israel may stimulate a nuclear arms race, because more and more examples are proving that if you do not have nuclear weapons, then you can be treated however anyone pleases. And we remember the relatively recent example of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who voluntarily renounce the development of nuclear weapons. I do not want to conclude on a pessimistic note, so I will emphasize once more. And frank and honest conversation is now overdue, so that we do not wake up in the morning to learn that instead of the scheduled negotiations, a war has begun, even though everyone heard that the negotiations would continue, and so that there are no such surprises which, moreover, turn into very serious consequences not only for those who attack, and not only for those who are attacked, but for everyone else as well, and for the global economy. Thank you very much. I think we will continue to meet. And probably today we have been convinced that one can speak not only about Ukraine, but also about other topics that concern our friends. Thank you very much, Sergey Viktorovich. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Goodbye.
До свидания.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency. Today, under the auspices of the Diplomatic Academy, Geometer Russia, we are pleased to welcome you to the next, already 11th meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergey Viktorovich Lavrov. Our roundtable is devoted to the topic, the Ukrainian crisis, digital threats, international information security. We traditionally count on an open and honest dialogue on the topical issues of the international agenda being raised. After the minister's address, an opportunity will be provided to ask Sergey Viktorovich questions. Please, Sergey Viktorovich. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, indeed, we are meeting far from the first time on the topic, which for us is the main one in international politics. The President has spoken about this repeatedly, as have other representatives of the Russian leadership. It is the main one, first and foremost, because the goal of the war against Russia that was prepared and ultimately unleashed by the West through the hands of the Ukrainian regime is to weaken, as they themselves say, to inflict a strategic defeat on our country. There are all grounds to believe that behind this lies the maximum desire to break up our country, which the President has also repeatedly reminded us of. But there are quite a few other events happening in the world, including what is now unfolding in the Middle East as a result of the aggression of the United States and Israel against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in this regard, of course, I cannot fail to mention this crisis, a crisis that is now sliding off the front pages, off television screens and social media, and which is indeed fraught with colossal consequences, negative consequences for the entire world, for global stability, the global economy, for everything that was once called globalization in the name of the prosperity of all humanity. All of this has been destroyed, and civilians are suffering, both in Iran and as a result of Iran's retaliatory actions in neighboring Arab states. We express our condolences regarding any civilian casualties. We see what damage is being inflicted on the civilian infrastructure of all the countries of the Persian Gulf. And, frankly speaking, we remember how the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, long before the United States and Israel began their campaign, publicly called for not using armed force against Iran, for resolving issues through diplomatic and political dialogue, publicly declared that they would not provide their territory or their airspace in the interests of unleashing a war against the Islamic Republic of Iran. They also said publicly, officially, that they would not give consent to the use of foreign military bases located on their territory to participate in this aggression. And yet they too were drawn into this war. I have no doubt that this was one of the goals of that operation, which is called either bestial roar or some other kind of wrath. I don't remember, because the goals are now being debated by many, including in the United States. Many politicians cannot understand what the goal of this operation actually is. President Trump publicly said that we eliminated Ayatollah Khomeini, otherwise he would have eliminated me. A few hours later, his Secretary of Defense declares that the U.S. was not involved in organizing the elimination of Ayatollah Khomeini. Well, we leave the question of what the United States is trying to achieve to the discretion of Congress, to the discretion of that political system which functions in the United States for such cases. But I have no doubt, I want to return to this once more, that one of the goals was to drive a wedge between the countries of the region, between the countries of the Persian Gulf, Iran, and its Arab neighbors, between whom, in recent years, up until recently, a positive process of normalization had been observed. This was most notably apparent when Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran normalized their relations. Russia actively contributed to this. But in fact, we have been advancing a unifying agenda for many, many long years. For more than 20 years, we have been holding events aimed at mobilizing support for the initiative to develop a security concept for the Persian Gulf zone that would encompass all the coastal countries, their key neighbors, and would also include, as we had originally envisioned, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, ensuring transparency, confidence-building measures, and concrete steps to use this richest region in the interests of the prosperity of the peoples of the relevant countries. But this concept remains